Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
Office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Constitutional measure with this administration, I can't tell you. I don't know. There are a few scholars who say it will, and others who say it's not likely to. But at a minimum, by the time it gets litigated, it will probably give some additional time while we're getting that $45 billion out to people who are, in fact, behind in the rent and don't have the money.
Hey everybody, thank you for tuning in. My name is Matt O'Connell and this is Spoken Truth Revolution. So as you probably saw, we played a couple clips from President Joe Biden. First one was his inauguration speech, and just to highlight, one of the things that the president, his sole purpose, that he solemnly swears that he will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And then that second clip, as you probably saw, was a interview. He was holding a press conference, and one of the questions was in relation to the CDC's eviction moratorium extension, in which, number one, the CDC doesn't have constitutional authority to enact any law. The laws are created by our legislation branch of government, which is Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. And then, of course, we have the Supreme Court and the executive branch, which is the other two branches of government. So the CDC technically is not a branch of the balance of power within our government. The only balance of power are the courts, Supreme Court, Congress, and the executive branch. But what I am concerned about is, number one, the CDC's continuous efforts to prod and chisel away at yours, my constitutional rights including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the right and freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to have private property. And what we've noticed is that the CDC no longer needs to give a clear-cut, analytical, science-driven, objective reason as to why they decide to do whatever they want to do. And we have a president and we have a political party, namely the Democratic Party and the left, who are continuously reverting their direction and deflection as well as it relates to reporters asking them questions about, hey, is there going to be an eviction moratorium? Are you going to enact mandatory mask mandates? Should there be a vaccine passport? They continuously, meaning Joe Biden, his staff, the Democrats, the left, etc., they keep referring, well, we'll see what the CDC says. We'll see what the CDC says. The CDC is not a governmental body that can create laws. So, therefore, anything that you may hear on the news, that the CDC may post on their website, that indicates anything in relation to whether it's a eviction moratorium or a mask mandates, that is not law. You cannot be arrested for it. You cannot be penalized by it. Now, of course, what the legislation can do, the House of Reps or the Senate, which they should do, they should take the recommendations of the CDC They should vote on the recommendations if they want to pass it into law, and then actually pass it into law. But the CDC is not, it's almost like the CDC is being positioned and propped up as if it's a monarchy, a authoritarian, totalitarian regime to enact the will of the left. And again, the left and the Democrats and Biden, they're just kind of passing the buck. So they're not like taking the blame. They're not even necessarily taking the credit, but they're like, oh, the CDC, they're the experts. They know what to do. They know how to guide us, and they have our best interests in mind, etc. But the purpose of the president is to defend the Constitution from any enemy, foreign and domestic. So any entity that comes against the Constitution. And what is the Constitution? The Constitution is what gives us our rights as people, our rights to be able to go to church, our rights to own our own property. And if we have a second property in which we rent out to position our livelihood to be in a better position, then we have a right to evict those individuals that are not paying the piper or paying their bills. We have a right to do that. But the CDC is trying to say, no, you don't. You don't have the right to do that. But we need to begin to speak up against it. And just quick, as a summary of the left's, the Democrats, the CDC, and frankly, the Republicans aren't really highlighting this. They're not really, some of them are, but most of them are not highlighting the fact that this unconstitutional measure by the CDC is not even being challenged by Joe Biden. In that second clip, Joe Biden says, well, let's just see what the courts say. The courts are going to say the CDC does not have the authority because the CDC isn't even in the Constitution. They're a bureaucratic entity that is supposed to provide the government information to then make legislation and vote on that legislation. So it alarms me that Biden so easily, though he took the oath of office to defend the Constitution, is now saying, listen, let's move forward with it anyways, even though it's likely illegal, likely unconstitutional. Let's just see what happens. Here's why I'm very concerned about this, because where is the line? When will they stop? Because if they don't stop, then I think most of us are just thinking that they're going to stop at some point, but I don't think they are. But let's kind of recap what's happened. So the CDC instituted the policies initially off some data. They got some data related to COVID early 2020, as you know, just as a quick recap. The first indication was 2 weeks to slow the spread. That was to alleviate hospitalizations and make ICU units available. And we did that. The public did that. We trusted the scientists at the time, and we were in unknown territory. And so we, as citizens, allowed the lockdown measures to occur. The shutting of the economy, closure of our businesses, virtual learning for children, so on and so forth. Now, the new mandates that are occurring with the masks and the children, requiring children to wear masks, and the CDC is promoting this, and certain localities are promoting this. There's no data about it, and here's the reason why that supports it. Because before the vaccine was well distributed amongst the society, children were not required to wear masks in a lot of schools. And so now we have the vaccine that's well distributed amongst the U.S. population, excuse me, and they're now requiring masks. But before, the vaccine wasn't well distributed amongst the population, and they didn't require masks before. So something is not adding up. And what they're doing is they just put a new label on COVID. They call it the Delta variant, the XYZ variant, the Fauci variant, whatever the case is. And they promote that, and they instill fear in people. And through fear, citizens will hand over their rights willingly without asking questions, because they tend to trust these bureaucrats because they wear a white lab coat. And that is not right. That is not right. They then identified what essential businesses were around June 2020 as they began to reopen the economy. What were essential businesses? Some include liquor stores, pot shops, strip clubs. But this is when things started to get a bit fishy. Remember this? when they were opening these other types of stores, liquor stores, pot shops, strip clubs, but then you couldn't go to church. What was the reasoning behind that? Some people were, you know, they were painted in a bad light because, they wanted to go to church. They felt church was essential. But if you don't believe in God, church isn't essential to that person. So essential is a subjective word, but used by the bureaucrats. But clearly, as we look at it objectively, they had a purpose in which they clearly hate God, they hate church, and they chose to not think church was essential to some people. That's not right. That's not based on objective data. And it's not constitutional that the CDC even allowed anything remotely close to that from being administered or trying to declare that it's a law to even do that. And then, as you may recall, the BLM protests, the Antifa protests, and the Trump rallies were going on right during this time because it was election year. You could burn cities down with BLM and Antifa. Wasn't a super spreader, but if you attended a Trump rally, that was a super spreader. If you went to church and sang hymns, that was a super spreader. But if you were protesting in the streets for Black Lives Matter and Antifa, both terrorist organizations, then those were okay because systematic racism, according to the CDC, was a quote unquote public health crisis as well. Now we have the eviction moratorium. So as you know, this was instituted because the government forcefully shut down the economy, forcefully had people laid off from their jobs because nothing was moving in the economy. The company that I work for was affected, and a lot of clients that we have were affected as well, pretty substantially. So perhaps the eviction moratorium made sense early on. But it does not make sense now to extend it. And here are some stats from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this is from August 6th, I believe it is, just to confirm. Let me just look at the date real quick. So this is from this is from August 6th. This is from today. So it says this: the labor force participation rate was little changed at 61.7% in July 2021 and has remained within a narrow range of 61.4% to 61.7% since June 2020. The participation rate is 1.6% points lower than in February 2020. The employment population ratio increased by 0.4% to 58.4%. In July and is up by 1 percentage point since December 2020. So here's, in other words, since June 2020 and in the current, or I should say it looks like it's backdating, July 2021, it only has changed between 61.4 to 61.7%. June 2020 is when the lockdowns were most restrictive and essential businesses could open according to the CDC. And now nearly everything is open, right? But people aren't going back to work. There's no incentive, especially when the Biden administration and the Democrats are, basically dangling the carrot in front of people saying, hey, we're going to pass another stimulus, or hey, we're going to give you a monthly stipend, or hey, we're going to extend the eviction moratorium. So now this is affecting landlords, and landlords are painted in a bad light according to the Democrats, the left, and the Biden administration, where you think it's these big companies and apartment complexes that they can deal with the eviction moratorium and they have the capital to cover it. No, that's not the case. There's a lot of people, even including myself, my wife and I, we've been discussing maybe purchasing a second home in a couple of years or so, to just to invest in our future and our to perhaps even pass something off to our children. But we would be in such a bind because we would be relying on that rent money to cover the expenses for that second home. So that's kind of a risk that people take. But the Biden administration, the Democrats, the left, and now the CDC, who doesn't have the authority to do anything like this, they're threatening to extend this eviction moratorium and not providing any incentive for people to return to work. So what's alarming, I already talked about that. Let's see. I'm just looking at my notes here. So if the Delta variant is so concerning to the CDC, to the Biden administration, to the Democrats, to the left, why is this government allowing the southern border to be completely open for thousands of immigrants to come in? I'm not opposed to immigration. I want people to have the same opportunities that we all have, and for them to go through the right mechanisms to do that. But we're talking about illegal immigrants. I live in Arizona, right on the border, and let me tell you, there are a lot of local news outlets that report on human trafficking, drug trafficking that likely, is a result of illegals coming over the border that the national media does not talk about whatsoever, because it would paint everything in a bad light. It would paint everything that they're all about in a bad light, and it would basically take the rug out from underneath all of their policies and initiatives. But if they're so concerned about COVID, if they're so concerned about the Delta variant, why are they, number one, now trying to muzzle up our children in schools, and affecting them, perhaps even psychologically? We don't even know the effects of masking children for 12 hours a day. And then we have the open border where migrants are coming in. We don't know if they're tested positive for COVID or not, but they're just releasing them into the community. So there's a lot of, from a statistical and data standpoint, the Biden administration, the Democrats and the left, and the CDC, they're not making sense. And it's okay to question that. They are not making sense. They have not provided ample reason to agree with their decisions. And I recently posted about this. If they gave some solid evidence and data and statistics, and they were transparent about that, I'd likely believe them. If they could prove their case statistically, from a data-driven standpoint, actual scientific standpoint. But they don't do that. They just say, you do what we tell you, you shut up, and you get the shot, and you put the mask on. And I'm here to say, no, don't do it. If you're a landlord, you do what you try to, or you may need to go through the courts. You may need to spend some money, but in the long run, this is for the future of our rights. And this is kind of the main pinnacle of today's video, is we're seeing slowly, even just within a year and a half, our rights being stripped. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, we're seeing that being stripped. We're seeing the right to freedom of speech being stripped, right to freedom of religion being stripped, and now private property being stripped. I think most of us, including myself, probably early on, it's like, all right, the government's probably not going to go any further than this. The COVID seems to be dying out. The left, the Biden administration, the Democrats, and the CDC have not taken their foot off the gas with trying to push more and more illegal legislation, illegal laws that they're trying to enact. But we need to begin to push back. If it's something from the CDC, like an eviction moratorium, there is nothing in the Constitution that gives the CDC the right to enact any type of law that has to go through the legislation, or perhaps even a executive order, which I don't think Biden would do because he'd get a lot of pushback. But it has to go through the House of Representatives, Senate, etc. But the CDC, when they tell you to do something, you do not have to do it. They are not a legislative body. The CDC is just there to give us information, and then for the legislators to make decisions about that. And then they vote on it, and sometimes the CDC provides recommendations that perhaps could be passed into the law. But they do not have the authority to have a blanket, mandatory mask. That cannot happen if it's coming from the CDC. So we need to continue to push back, because if we don't push back, again, as I mentioned before, we're seeing certain rights that we have as law-abiding citizens, the right to free speech, the right to freedom of religion, private property, slowly being stripped away. And we're thinking, they won't go any further. They won't go any further. I want to challenge you and say, I bet you they will if we don't stand up and say no. I bet you they will if all of us, not just me and just the main folks that speak out against this, they will push as far as they can if we let them. So we need to stand up and we need to say no if it's coming from the CDC and they're trying to create a law in which they cannot do. And we have the Constitution on our side when we do that. Have a great day.